The IDAWRA is dedicated to the advancement of water resources management, research, and education. Members represent a community of water professionals with diverse backgrounds, but they share engagement in solving some of the toughest water resources challenges. Thank you to our sponsors and members, Avista Corporation, Brown & Caldwell, Haley & Aldridge, HDR Engineering, and Jacobs Engineering Group. Stay in touch at awraidaho.org.
So my name is Mike Schubert. So let me turn my video on. Hi, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Schubert. I'm the president of the Idaho section of the AWRA. Thanks for joining us today. We have an exciting webinar presenting the final EIS of the Columbia River System Operations Environmental Impact Statement. Before we get into that, I'd like to just say a couple words about our organization. AWRA is dedicated to the advancement of water resources management, research, education. Our members represent a community of water professionals with diverse backgrounds who share engagement in solving some of the toughest water resources challenges. Idaho section, our activities are planned by our board members. We've put a good bit of work into our website, so please visit our website at awraidaho.org. On our website, you'll find we have an Idaho events calendar that includes both our events and events of other organizations who've been willing to share information on those events. So that's, our goal is that's a hub for information on events related to water resources in Idaho. We also have recordings of our previous webinars, as well as recordings of a new feature that we started called Meet the Professional. I think we, at some time, the organization did those as webinars or in-person Meet the Professional interviews. Now those are recorded and those are online. If you'd like to participate in one of those, have a brief interview recorded and available to others in the area, please let us know. We're always looking for participants. The other item administratively that we have is we'll be having our annual meeting for the Idaho section of AWRA as a virtual meeting this year. We're working on an exciting format, and so please keep your eye on your email. We'll be sending out information on our virtual annual meeting soon. And now on to today's webinar. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Bureau of Reclamation, and Bonneville Power Administration released a joint record of decision for the Columbia River System Operations Final Environmental Impact Statement on September 28th of this year. This final EIS documents the detailed analyses of environmental, social, and economic benefits and consequences to the affected resources of alternatives considered for improved integration operations. The preferred alternative documented in the EIS includes implementation of innovative dam operations that balance fish benefits and energy goals. And we're looking forward to learning more about that from our speaker, Jarod Blades. Jarod is Reclamation's policy lead on the EIS and is with us today to present a summary of the EIS. Jarod holds a PhD in Natural Resources Management and Policy from the University of Idaho. So without further delay, I'd like to say again, thanks to Jarod for joining us today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Mike. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thanks again, and good afternoon or good morning if you're on the Pacific side. As Mike mentioned, I am the Columbia River Environmental Compliance Lead for the Bureau of Reclamation. I also come from the project management world and work on a variety of natural resource related issues. I just want to take a quick second to allow my team participants that are here to introduce themselves. I'll be out front presenting today, but I asked several folks to be here to help try and keep me out of trouble. They've put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into this document, and they'll be able to fill in gaps where needed. and answer any in-depth questions that I'm not able to field. So why don't we start with that? Who do we have on with us from Bonneville Power Administration? We start with Birgit.
Hi, I'm Birgit Kohler. I was the power lead for the EIS for Bonneville Power, but I kind of kept my feelers out for all of the different resource areas.
Thanks. How about Jason? Jason Sweet might be on mute.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
Can you hear me now? All right, I got off the double mute. Good morning. My name is Jason Sweet. I manage the Fish Operations Policy and Planning Group for Bonneville Power. I was involved in the fish and wildlife part of the analysis towards the end of the EIS. I wasn't involved for the whole thing, but came in to help out at the end. So I'm glad to be here today and appreciate the time. Thanks.
Thanks, Jason. Leah?
Hi, Jarod. My name is Leah Sullivan. I work for Bonneville Power Administration and was supporting the ESA team and our ESA lead, Greg Smith, through the final steps of the biological assessment of the preferred alternative to the EIS. Back to you, Jarod.
Thank you. And you mentioned Greg Smith. Are you on the line?
Hi, Jarod. Yeah, I'm here. It's Greg Smith. I've helped on the ESA consultation component of this exercise.
Thanks for being here, folks. Anybody else from Bonneville? Okay, let's go to the Corps of Engineers. Cindy, are you on the line? Now I'm looking through the numbers and the names. We may not have representation from the Corps, and that's okay. But I want to open it up. Anybody else from the Corps that might be on the line? Okay, how about others with the Bureau of Reclamation?
Hi, everybody. My name is Jeff McLaughlin. I'm the habitat coordinator for the Bureau here in Boise, and I worked on the proposed action for the habitat portion of the biome.
Thanks, Jeff. Sue Camp, are you on the line? She may not be able to speak. I know she's joining remotely and she might be in transit. So Sue Camp is our resident fisheries expert related to resident and anadromous species. For the EIS, she was instrumental in primarily resident species with a little bit of support in the anadromous side. So thanks again, everybody from the agencies for being here, and thanks to all of you for providing time for us to present. We know your organization, and we really appreciate the good work that you do related to conservation and policy and a variety of other topics. So thanks again. So the Columbia River System Operations EIS. It has been a long 4 years for us, and we just signed the final record of decision on September 28th. That was signed by all three co-lead agencies, the Corps, Bonneville, and Reclamation. All of this was related to the operation and maintenance and configuration of the 14 federal dams on the Columbia and Snake. So a little bit of fun facts. Some of you may know this already, but for the Columbia Basin, it is extremely important to the region, the Columbia River and the Snake River. It's over 1,200 miles long, an area the size of France. And in terms of electrical capacity, it represents 40% of the region. In terms of hydropower, 90% comes from the Columbia River system, so a substantial amount. And Grand Coulee, I'll touch on it since I'm from Reclamation, is the backbone of that system. It produces 20% of the Pacific Northwest's electric capacity. So very important to the region. We started this process back in 2016. Initially, we were going to go through 2021 but we received a presidential memorandum that ordered us to complete it in a year's less time. And we received guidance from the Council on Environmental Quality about how to navigate that in terms of milestones. So our completion date, as I mentioned, was September 28th of this year. And just a little background on the dynamics of what this team has gone through in the last 4 years. We've dealt with all kinds of changes, and change happens, but we've seen substantial changes in staff in terms of retirements, natural attrition. And I think in a lot of organizations, you just see a lot of institutional knowledge going out the door in terms of retirement. So it was incumbent on many on this call and many others to kind of step up in those roles and try to carry that institutional knowledge forward. And I think we did that well. We saw changing environmental policy in terms of the National Environmental Policy Act. We saw changing ESA regulations. We saw ever-changing schedules, right? I'm sure many of you that have worked on long-term projects can understand that. And the staff was very resilient, working on that abbreviated timeline. Just for your awareness, there was over about 350 staff from across the 3 co-lead agencies and over 30 cooperating agencies that contributed and touched the project in some way. A lot of involvement from other states, from the 4 states, from tribes, from local governments, from nonprofits, and other non-GOs. I'm sorry, I'm trying to advance the slide. There we go. So this just kind of lays out for those of you who aren't as familiar with the NEPA process. I mentioned we started in 2016, and that took us through scoping. We received, I believe it was on the order of 260,000 scoping comments. And just for your awareness, about 200,000 of those were form letters related to breaching or removal of the 4 lower snake dams. Based on those scoping comments, internal expertise from our cooperators and others, we developed alternatives and made a plan for our detailed analysis. We issued the draft EIS in February of 2020. We had a public comment and review period, released the final EIS in July of this year, and then again signed the ROD in September, at the end of September. So a little more context on the system itself. This shows you where the 14 federal dams are located. You can see the red represents Corps of Engineer dams. The blue represent reclamation dams. And this circle here, that shows those 4 lower Snake River dams that have received so much attention. It's also important to note these colors within the basin. That's just how we broke up the different watersheds for our analysis purposes and for how we described our effects analysis. Our affected environment and the environmental consequences. So you can see A, B, C, D when you see that, if you see that in the document. But it's a little bit misleading because really our area of analysis is just where we're having significant effects along the main stem Columbian snakes, and then also with any tributaries where we may have projects. So the actual analysis area was more constrained to the main stem and tributaries. I mentioned the over 30 cooperating agencies across state, local government, tribes. And then associated with this large EIS was also the Endangered Species Act Section 7 consultations with the National Marine Fisheries Service and Fish and Wildlife. I mean, of course, it's important to note that, salmon and steelhead, these are icons of our region of the Northwest, and especially in relation to tribal culture and the regional economy. And it's seen a lot of degradation over the years from various sources in terms of habitat degradation, urbanization, harvest within the river and the ocean, multiple predation factors from marine mammals, birds, other predaceous fish. And we've also seen genetic degradation to wild populations from some of those hatchery fish interactions. And of course, these hydroelectric and flood risk management dams. Another topic that was important to folks was blocked areas above Chief Joseph and Grand Coulee, and then above the Hell's Canyon complex and above Dwarshak. We'll get into that a little bit more, but that was an important topic. So just wanted to give you a little context for the area that we are working, and that means so much to us. I also want to give some background on the legal aspects. So we've been dealing with about 25 years of litigation on the Columbia River, and we've suffered a great deal of losses throughout those years in the form of remands of our biological opinions. That happened in, 93 was a remand, 2003, 2005, 2011, and then 2016 was our most recent remand. And so we received a very lengthy adverse opinion in 2016 that I want to touch on a little bit. A big part of that was the violation of NEPA, which is the impetus for, it was a contributing factor, obviously, of why we're doing this EIS, why we started in 2016. That, and because it had also been, since 1995, was our first system, a complete system environmental study. So it was timely, or was due. We also, aside from that, had associated biological assessments and biological opinions, as I mentioned. And it was strongly recommended that we consider, again, the breaching of the 4 lower Snake River dams. So there's a lot of rationale for why we're in the process now and the context for it. I want to go into a little bit of the range of alternatives. These look like four discrete action alternatives, including the no action. But it's important to note that even though they have general themes like this multiple objective 1 on the left, shows moderate fish benefits, MO2 is power, dam breach, and then lower river fish benefits. Those are overarching themes that kind of simplifies thinking about them. But there is a vast suite of objectives that went into each one of those alternatives. For example, fish passage was very important across all 4 alternatives. So this represented our wide and reasonable range of alternatives that was generated over time with lots of input from a lot of different parties. We did end up identifying a preferred alternative that was built from a combination of measures of those alternatives. We really tried to optimize this preferred alternative by picking the best things from each that we really thought would have the most benefit across biological, social, economic impacts across the region. So on the draft EIS, we received almost 60,000 comments over a 45-day period. And a lot of those were represented by form letters, about 55,000 of those. But we received a tremendous amount of substantive comments. And you can imagine the effort and care that went into trying to digest and respond effectively and consider the recommendations and act on those for the final EIS. It was quite the involved process. You can see some of the key themes here, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. Like I said, there's a ton behind this. But we saw a great amount of support, of trying to balance the resources. That's always a major challenge, is looking at multiple resources among hydropower, navigation, transportation, irrigation, endangered and resident species. We also got a lot of support, just like during the scoping process, for consideration of breaching the lower Snake River dams and how that affects some populations of salmonid species, both anadromous and resident, and also killer whales And then we took a hard look at the economic impacts, and that was important to folks, which is why we were comprehensive on that front. As I mentioned earlier, we also had great interest in consideration of reintroduction or passage above some of those blocked areas, primarily in the Upper Columbia, related to Chief Joe and Grand Coulee. And there was also a lot of frustration in terms of the NEPA process and compliance, working under this greatly accelerated schedule with as many partners as we had. We really tried to do a comprehensive job, and we felt justified in that. And we laid out a clear path of how we conducted that. But that did not mean that people did not have frustrations. There's frustration in the region, and understandably, it was a very accelerated schedule, and because of that, we couldn't extend the comment period. And trying to work your way through, a 10,000 plus page document in that amount of time is very challenging, and we certainly understood that. So our selected alternative in the final EIS, we did choose our preferred alternative, which I again mentioned had a combination of measures where we tried to optimize the maximum amount of benefits and minimize environmental consequences and costs. A big part of that was related to surface spill. It included up to 125% total dissolved gas for anadromous fish passage. I'll get into more of that in the next slide. One interesting thing of note, and these are kind of the highlights. There's a lot behind it, and I'll show more of that in the subsequent slides. Another interesting part was higher spring water elevations and the John Day pool to try to delay avian predation nesting, just giving those juvenile steelhead a chance to migrate past the project before nesting takes place on Blaylock Islands like Caspian terns, for example. There's a suite of water and power management improvements that were built into the selected alternative. And there was also benefits to water supply. At Grand Coulee, we did allocate up to an additional 500,000 acre feet for irrigation or water supply purposes. And I don't want to go into this in great detail, but I just wanted to give you kind of a sampling of some of the ongoing measures that were carried forward. So this selected alternative did not represent a wholesale change in how we operate in the river and manage our natural resources. There was a lot of beneficial actions that we carried forward from our previous commitment. And this kind of gives you a sampling of those among habitat, operational, hatcheries, and predation actions. So I'll give you a second just to kind of peruse through that, but these are some of the good things that we carried forward. Some of the other ongoing mitigation programs, and several of these aren't directly tied to our action in the environmental impact statement, but they're noteworthy just so that you know that there are ongoing programs that are associated with this environmental impact statement, such as Bonneville's Fish and Wildlife Program, Lower Snake Comp Plan, Fish Mitigation Program from the Corps, our Tributary Habitat Program from Reclamation and through Bonneville. Cultural Resources Program is being carried forward. There's a suite of predation management along the main stem that will be continued forward and built upon. Invasive species and pests will be continued and improved upon. Nutrient supplementation at various locations in the basin will be carried forward, and we added a few as well. And ongoing Kootenai River white sturgeon actions up in the northern part of the basin. So the main point there is just that there's a wide array of things that we carried forward just because we were very satisfied with the effect that they were having on the basin. So let's get into some of the new stuff that's coming through the EIS related to operations. And I just want to touch on really quick here before we dive into these, that you'll notice that the selected alternative did not include breach or removal of the lower 4 Snake River dams. And that was for a variety of reasons. One was, I mentioned earlier, we have to balance multiple authorities and multiple resources And while removal of those 4 dams would benefit some populations of anadromous and resident species, when weighed against the costs or the impacts, and especially social and economic front, when you do the aggregate benefits of each alternative, our selected alternative just has greater amounts of overall benefits compared to that particular alternative. But it was important that we did an in-depth comprehensive analysis on that just to show the trade-offs. One big thing that you'll see coming out of the selected alternative is what's known as the Flexible Spill Agreement, or the Flex Spill Working Group. And what this is a partnership among regional sovereigns, the action agencies, the 3 co-lead agencies, Oregon, Washington, Nez Perce Tribe participated for a bit, and others. And what this was built on these 3 must-haves, if you will, of fish passage, generation of power, and operational feasibility. We can get it done, right? There's also a 4th pillar that has been incorporated, and that's related to learning and potential adaptive management as we move forward. So studying if we're getting the effects, the beneficial effects that we anticipated, and if not, how do we adapt? Another big part of this was litigation forbearance. So this allowed us to avoid litigation with those parties during the last part of the EIS from 2019 to 2020. This group has shown a great interest in working together into the future. So I know that there are plans to keep this working group going, and they're laying the groundwork and foundation for that currently. But along the bottom there, you can kind of see some of the foundational considerations that was really important to folks that were involved in this group. So this has been considered, at least to the co-lead agencies, as a great success and something to build on. This is where, when I mentioned 125% total dissolved gas earlier, this allows for 16 hours per day for reaching up to that 125% TDG for a surface spill. And then it allows 8 hours on the rest of the day for Bonneville to generate power using performance standard spill to maximize power generation, and they can move those 8 hours at various times of the day based on market conditions. And so I just wanted to give you a little extra information on that. So aside from some of the operational changes, you know what, before I jump into the operational changes, Leah, do you want to say just a quick couple words about the steelhead overshoot operational change? You noted that that was important, and I agree. You might just want to say, 30 seconds on what's happening with that. Or Jason, either one of you, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, I'll jump in there.
Okay.
This was an operation that was contemplated in a couple of the MOs, but it was refined when we went into the final biological opinion. And what it is, it's an operation that we actually provide some spill over our surface passage weirs during the fall, and then again in March, times of the year where we traditionally don't provide juvenile fish passage spill. And this was an operation that was intended to benefit both Snake River steelhead, and it's going to have an ancillary benefit for Snake River juvenile fall chinook as well. It provides them just another opportunity for safe passage under traditional times when they only had turbines or bypass systems available to them. So again, it's about 2 months of total operation of these projects, providing some spill at times of year that's new for them. So something we added in at the end here to help provide some additional benefits to those stocks. Over.
Thanks for that, Jason.
Yeah, sorry, Jarod, I was having some mute issues on this end.
That's okay, Leah. Thanks anyways. So let's jump into non-operational conservation measures. So not associated with the operation of moving water through the 14 federal dams. This shows just a sampling of some of those, and we'll get into a little bit more detail in the next slide. But we're still doing lots of estuary restoration work down in the lower river. We've made improvements on our tributary habitat programs. It's now represented across the co-lead agencies as the Tributary Habitat Steering Committee, and they're laying the groundwork for how to include regional experts and how to make collaborative decisions regarding tributary restoration or improvement, I should say. We're also continuing to fund conservation and safety net hatcheries. I mentioned earlier, we do have a comprehensive predation management program that's moving forward with some additional actions, and then a large research monitoring and evaluation program to test over time. Like I said, are we getting the results that we anticipated, and how do we adapt possibly over time? Some other new mitigation actions that I thought might be of interest to this group. We've got some habitat improvement actions happening along the Kootenai River above Bonner's Ferry with Cottonwood. There's also riparian and wetland restoration happening along the Kootenai River below Libby Dam. In Lake Roosevelt, we're evaluating a couple of things. One is tributary access out of Lake Roosevelt, primarily for bull trout and other resident species. And we're also looking at spawning habitat conditions in some of those shallower water areas, and how we might be able to enhance or augment some of those spawning habitats using gravel. Up to 100 acres is what we've proposed thus far. Also back up north in the Kootenai River, we're looking at, again, tributary mouth access, where you sometimes can see sediment aggradation or buildup, where it makes access from the main stem to tributary habitats difficult. And if there's a way we can mitigate that, we're going to explore that. We also added some nutrient enhancement up in that part of the woods. We also think it's important to stay current and update our invasive species and pest management plans. So that's some examples of some of the new actions that are coming out of this selected alternative.
Hey, Jared.
Yes.
Hey, this is Sue. You can hear me, yay.
Yeah.
I wanted to clarify just a little bit on the spawning habitat augmentation at Lake Roosevelt. The habitat, the tributary access and the habitat augmentation in the reservoir is primarily for kokanee, a resident rainbow trout. Bull trout do use the area just kind of transitory, but they don't spawn there. So just kind of wanted to highlight that through an EIS process, we were able to get some benefits for the non-ESA listed fish out there as well.
Thanks for that, Sue. I should have clarified bull trout prey species.
There you go, thanks.
So a little bit more detail on our associated Section 7 consultations. As I mentioned, the Flex Bill Working Group allowed for litigation forbearance, and we submitted biological assessments to NIMFS and the Fish and Wildlife Service in January of 2020. Some important aspects of that are we really tried to take a hard look at separating our effects analysis into different buckets. For what's happening because of our proposed action, what's happening due to things that already exist in the environmental baseline, and what does that look like moving forward. I'm happy to report that we really did develop or maintain working relationships that were very beneficial. Sorry, you may hear a doorbell. That's the neighborhood kids really trying to get my son's attention. We did receive the final biops in the middle of this year, and the conclusions were acceptable. We had non-jeopardy across the board, nor adverse modification of critical habitat. And we got concurrence on several species for not likely to adversely affect. But we did get a great suite of terms and conditions, reasonable and prudent measures that included terms and conditions and conservation recommendations, and we're moving forward on those very diligently. So just quickly at a high level, some of the anticipated benefits, they go across the spectrum of all of our authorities and interests, right? So various benefits you'll find related to ESA and resident fish, notably including lamprey and other wildlife resources. On the power front, it was very important to us to make sure that we had enough adequate power supply that was affordable and reliable. Irrigation and water supply, I mentioned that we're maintaining or carrying forward all of those actions and also adding that additional 45,000 acre feet. We're updating some of our flood risk management, and that will help greatly ensure, or to a greater extent, ensure human life and safety. And then regional coordination. This is a big part that's coming out of both the EIS and the consultation processes. We are committed to being very active, and we're maintaining a lot of the existing forums and work groups that currently exist in the region, but we're also looking at innovative new collaborative approaches to discussing topics like the reintroduction above blocked areas and some of the forums that have come out of the core, formerly known as the four-state process. That's being evaluated and seeing how that can be carried forward in a broader sense to include tribal input and other various organizations. So a lot happening on the regional coordination front, and that's an important point, is that it doesn't just stop here at the signing of the record of decision. There's a lot of momentum, positive momentum, that I think is moving forward. So what happens next? I mentioned, we're keeping a very close track on our environmental compliance commitments, and that will include tracking and reporting. We're currently in the process of developing an integrated, relational database that will track and help us report on all the commitments that you'll find within both the EIS and the BIOPS. I mentioned monitoring and adaptive management. That's a really important component. We don't just let it go and hope that everything turns out for the best. We track it, and hopefully we can adjust if needed. And I mentioned those existing and new regional forums. This is just a sampling of kind of some of the things we look at as we're tracking. I don't want to go into great detail, but as appropriate, we'll probably be reaching out to some of your members to help us with that effort. So where you can go, CRSO.info has a great wealth of all of the activities that took place during the EIS. That's where you can find all the documents, all the scoping materials, all the news releases, those types of information. There's actually a video from Grand Coulee related to the record of decision. And this is important. If you're really not that, excited about diving into a 12,000 page document, the executive summary that you'll find right on the front page of CRSO.info is a much more relatively concise and a little bit more digestible format to take in the information. So with that, I just want to say thanks again for providing this time and giving us the chance to share our work. And I'd love to open the floor up to any questions that you might have. So thanks again.
Great, thank you, Jarod. If you have any questions, I'd ask, I guess we could do it one of two ways. But I would really prefer everyone put your questions in the chat box. That prevents us having multiple people coming off mute and asking a question at the same time. So if you have any questions, please enter those into the chat box, and Jarod, I can read those to you.
Perfect, thanks. And again, I'll be opening it up to the larger team across the co-lead agencies.
Okay, I haven't seen any come in yet. My guess is, well, maybe people are taking their time to formulate a real in-depth question. Okay, here's one from Rob. How was passage evaluated for juveniles in the reservoirs?
That's a great question. I imagine, Jason, you're probably well suited to answer that.
Sure. Yeah, for a lot of the fish passage measures, juveniles and adults both, we used a suite of different modeling techniques. For juvenile passage through the reservoirs in particular, we used two different models. We used the comparative survival study, which was developed by local states and tribal agencies. And we also used a NOAA fisheries-based model, the COMPASS model and life cycle models. So those two models led us to kind of different conclusions on some of these outcomes, depending on what type of mortality assumptions were built into this. We tried to measure both direct mortality through the reservoirs, but we also paid attention to what's known as latent mortality. So that's mortality that is occurring due to passage through the dams or the reservoirs, but we don't see that expressed until later after they've left the system. So again, it was a combination of modeling techniques that helped us assess the various risks associated with the multiple objective alternatives and the preferred alternative. And then we use those to kind of use those as bookends almost, since they did lead us to different conclusions.
Thanks, Jason. Is there any follow-up on that, Rob, or did that answer your question? Okay.
Rob does have follow-up on that question, specifically, what percentage of fish pass?
So I don't have it broken down by specific reservoir, but in general, we tracked what's known as in-river survival. So that's survival of juvenile smolts that move down from Lower Granite Dam down to below Bonneville Dam. And the various models predicted anything between 60% survival and 50% survival for fish moving through the entire system. So through an individual reservoir, it would probably be up in the 90% range per dam per reservoir.
Great, thank you. The next question comes from Timothy Link. I'm curious to hear whether and how coordination with Canadian groups are handled.
I think Birgit Kohler is gonna answer that one.
Hello, everybody. So I worked on the Columbia River Treaty for 10 years before we put together the EIS. So we did not work with Canada at all on this operation. That, as most of you may be aware, the United States is ongoing in negotiations with Canada, and we really didn't want these two processes to get crosswise at all. So we decided to take no speculation on Canadian operations at all and simply operate to the current treaty in the EIS. And then we did that modeling once at the beginning and held the Canadian operations constant. We do have in our models, as you can imagine, because the Canadian projects are upstream of many of the CRS projects, we have the Canadian dams in our standard computer models, but we did not do any further coordination with Canada.
Great, thank you.
Okay, if anyone has another question, see, we still have about 15 minutes for just open question and answer. So if you have a question, type it into the chat box. I'm happy to read that to Jarod and the group. We'll give everyone another minute to finish that. Okay, here's another one from Rob. How was tributary habitat capacity factored into the EIS process?
Sue, do you want to try to take that one on, or maybe Jeff?
Searching for the unmute button. And Jason, you can help me out as far as the preferred alternative analysis, but I know to look at the, across the 4 multi-objective analyses or multi-objective alternatives that we had, we considered that tributary habitat capacity was static among each one. So Jason, I know that was not the case for the preferred alternative analysis, so you might expand on that for me.
Sorry, so I got distracted there.
Oh.
Could you repeat the question?
Sorry, no, the question was, how is tributary habitat capacity factored into the process? And I said that when we did the alternative of the multi-objective alternatives, we considered that it was the same. We didn't manipulate tributary habitat capacity among the alternatives, but I didn't know if you factored it in differently for the preferred alternative analysis.
No, it was done the same for the preferred alternative. Oh, okay. We just assumed that the current rate of work would continue and that we didn't alter capacity in the habitat up there.
This is Jeff. If I can just add a little bit, the biological opinion and biological assessment process was an appendix to the EIS and goes into the habitat, I guess, in a little more detail. It's kind of the nuts and bolts versus the Columbia River wide view. And in that portion, and just from a habitat program in general, carrying capacity is much more prevalent in this new biological opinion than in past biological opinions, and is a tool that's going to be used quite a bit at both the sub-basin level, but also at the MPG levels for determining habitat priorities and also looking at, you know, kind of where we're at. Long-term planning, I guess, is what I would call it. But as a for instance, there's a large planning document in the Limhi Upper Salmon Basin, and when you look at the Limhi River in particular, there's carrying capacity is pretty prominent in that analysis, and you know, essentially where we're at is the river as it currently stands, you know, probably has capacity to raise, you know, 30 or 40% of the juveniles required to hit recovery. And so that's actually an accomplishable metric, and it really allows a lot of planning to move forward as far as how much habitat's required and where. So anyway, a lot of carrying capacity work going on at the sub-basin level with different methods and different models. That's it.
Thanks, Jeff.
Okay, our next question is from Kendra Kaiser. What does the adaptive management plan look like?
You want me to try to tackle that one, Jared?
Yeah, sure. I was thinking you or Leah would be great. Thanks.
Okay. So I can speak to it at least from the hydro system passage perspective. Again, I mentioned under the question on the reservoir passage that we used 2 different modeling techniques to evaluate the potential outcomes for these operations. And again, they led to very different conclusions. The comparative survival study predicts large increases in salmon abundance based on this preferred alternative. The life cycle model actually predicted a little bit of risk. It's due to shifting fish out of transportation from the barges and putting them more in a river situation. So again, there's some uncertainty from these models. And at least on the hydro system side of this, we wanted to build an adaptive management framework that would allow us to test and further evaluate the assumptions of these models and to see which one of these would be closer to the actual results. But we didn't want to build something that was so developed and prescribed by the federal agencies that there wouldn't be any buy-off in the region. So we left it a little bit open-ended, and we're anticipating developing the details of the hydro system modeling with our co-managers, states and tribal fisheries agencies, folks that have expertise in both the modeling and the fish behavior and biology behind these models. So at least from the hydro system perspective, that's what we did. We've got a plan in place, but it was left intentionally a little open-ended to help to get some regional buy-in on what the details of that will actually look like. But the goal is to monitor the effects of these operations very closely and to determine how the fish are responding to our preferred alternative on the hydro operations side. I'm not sure if Jeff or Greg or anybody else on the habitat side wanted to touch on any adaptive management from tributary habitat or other sides of the operation. Over.
I would just throw out real quick for the habitat portion, the way that the new BIOP is structured, it's a 15-year time period. And we've essentially broken it into 3 5-year cycles. And so the basic plan on the habitat side is to do pretty simple annual reporting up to that 5-year mark, and then do a pretty extensive analysis that hasn't been completely formulated yet. But there'll be a lot of life cycling modeling from NOAA, and a real hard look at each of the basins, and then using that analysis an opportunity to change the direction of the program as necessary to fit, new science and the results of that analysis.
Jarod, anyone else want to weigh in on that before we go to the next question?
Those were the two fronts that I was thinking mostly, was in terms of hydro operations and habitat.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Our next question comes from Adrian Marshall. Could you talk about expected major changes, if any, to power generation and GHG emissions in the preferred alternative?
This is Birgit. I can take that one. So major changes in power generation. Well, the flexible spill arrangement, which was included to benefit fish, of course, has a big change to power operations. It increases the amount of water going through the spillways, so there's less going through the turbines. And on an annual average, the advantage of having these chats ahead of time is you can pull up some figures and get the number. So on an annual average, the hydropower system loses 210 megawatts of electricity on a system that generates somewhere on the scale of 8,000 annually. So it's a measurable amount. We lose more generation in the spring when the spill increases, but then regain a little generation in the late summer from reduced spill late summer. There were also some other smaller changes that help increase flexibility in the hydro system, like a little bit of extra room on 5 of the projects, the Lower Snake and John Day during the fish operation season. Normally they're crimped down to 1.5 foot or 1 foot operating range. We got an extra 1/2 foot in there, a little more flexibility, a little more certainty in the operation, and perhaps a little more winter water out of Dworshak that helps. The flexibility was the really big thing that was important to the hydro system to get in exchange for the lost average generation, because hydro system flexibility helps with wind integration and solar power integration, which you can imagine is going to be a bigger and bigger issue as time goes forward. So those are the big changes in power. What that means is, though, because of the net reduction in hydropower emission, 210 average megawatts, that means that other power plants in the region will increase generation, and wind and solar are already generating what they can. So in the short term, the replacement generations would come from natural gas plants, and that leads to an increase of about 500,000 metric tons of carbon emissions, or 1.5% in the Northwest power sector carbon emissions. Well, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Birgit.
And if you want me to, I can go into the next question from Mitchell Cutter, because climate change is another area. Not Mitchell, there was one about, yes, that was Mitchell's, from climate change. How impacts of climate change factor into each alternative, especially in regard to water temperature and fish migration and survival. I'll give you part of the answer. So we did some modeling of climate change through an ancillary study called, awkwardly, RMJOC2, because it's a River Management Joint Operating Committee that chartered that. And that's looking at how water flows will change in the future. We did not do explicit modeling of water temperature. The science on that, there was a lot of temptation to do so, but a number of well-respected organizations like Pacific Northwest National Labs, PNNL, have done attempts at modeling water temperature, and really the science isn't there yet to do that. So we restrained ourselves from doing that quantitatively, but qualitatively, certainly there's an understanding that air temperature will go up and that will affect water temperature, but groundwater temperature is a big factor also in affecting river temperature. So each resource area then used, resource area meaning water quality team and the fish team and the navigation and recreation and power team. Power we did a little more modeling, but the other teams used the impacts of how we expect the natural rivers to change, and from there infer what it means for the resource area. So I'm going to turn it over to the fish folks. The fish biologists tell you a little bit more what that means for fish migration and survival, but we were not able to do numerical modeling on what the water temperature changes would be. So I'll leave it to Jason or Leah if you want to expand more on that. Over.
I've been doing a lot of talking, so Leah or Sue, if you guys want to handle the fish side of that, feel free to jump in.
Jason, this is Leah. I can share some of NOAA's analysis on our biological assessment and during our ESA consultation as it relates to climate change. But I don't have, line of sight on climate change analysis for the EIS. Would it be of value to at least share some of the climate change information from NOAA?
Leah,
Or if we can direct folks.
Oh, this is Sue. I think that'd be really valuable. And I just add, as Birgit explained, the climate change team described what expected changes would be, and then the fish teams just overlaid those over the results that we came up with qualitatively in most cases. And so probably the more specific information would be on the ESA side. So that'd be really helpful, Leah.
Okay. So Jason, I'm going from memory. So help keep us on the straight and narrow here. But in short, the analysis that was presented from NOAA showed that, a 40-year out analysis. Is that right, Jason? Was it 2040? Which would actually only be 20 years out. Yeah, so that would be 20 years out. And it looked at warming temperatures, and it also looked at increased flows in the fall. And for the juvenile life cycle piece, it didn't seem to, the model itself showed little to no impacts on the juvenile stage, as well as the out migration of juveniles to the ocean, where we saw potential future impacts were to adults returning based on ocean conditions and warming ocean condition temperatures. So as it relates to the hydro system, those changes in climate change that are predicted appear to have little impact on the juvenile outmigration phase, as well as the rearing phase, and even some of the adult spawning pieces. And that's kind of holistically the take-home message, at least, from my perspective. Jason, do you want to add any more details to that?
I think you hit it well from my perspective, Leah, unless there's any other questions.
No questions from Mitchell. So we're right at the top of the hour. I had, I think, one last question to kind of give us a chance to sum things up from Tim Brewer. How soon will changes start being implemented?
I can start, and then I would ask others to help bring some specifics. But upon the signing of the record of decision on September 28th, that began a new phase of operational management and configuration and non-operational conservation measures. So I believe the new operational measures are in place, and we are moving forward on a lot of it is mostly planning phase for the non-operational conservation actions. But yeah, from September 28th, we are launching forward. Jason or Leah, I don't know if you want to speak to some of those operational changes that are happening now for the fall period.
Yeah, Jared, I can share that the operation for adult steelhead and providing a surface spill route for those that have overshot their natal tribs, that operation began on October 1st for the Lower Snake River projects. And McNary, that operation has begun as well with some study and add-on monitoring components. So that's one of the ones straight out of the gate that we had prepared to implement beginning October 1. And there are also some power flexibility measures that have also been implemented since the signing of the rods. Over.
Great, thanks. And I mentioned earlier, and Jeff McLaughlin touched on it, but efforts like the Tributary Habitat Steering Committee, they're laying the groundwork for the, is it the TRIB technical team and other entities to start providing, soliciting participation and then moving into the future, providing feedback. Does anybody want to add anything else in terms of changes that are starting now?
Jared, I think I'd just add that I think one of the most valuable things that came out of this was just the development and the care and feeding of relationships between us and the cooperating agencies, and the technical exchange of information was really good. We just did, I think, a really good job with this process of working directly with folks, and I think that's really valuable and starting immediately as well.
Thanks for that, Sue.
Yep, and thanks everybody. I have to run another meeting, so.
So Mike, I think that's good for us. Yeah, to echo that, thanks again. And we find it really valuable to have these conversations, and thanks for all the great questions.
You're welcome, Jared. Thank you to you and the whole team for joining you and for the presentation and the hard work over the last 4 years. I know it's hard to boil 4 years of work into a 1 hour presentation. So again, with you, kind of echo your statement to check out the documentation, the executive summary, and if you're interested, the full document online. And I think we'll post a link to the I think we actually have the link posted on our website. If not, we'll make sure we get it posted. And again, thanks Jared, thanks to your team, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.